Hi, my name's Pip. I'm one of the physios at Sydney Advanced Physiotherapy, and today I thought I would talk a little bit about hypermobility and the pelvic floor. With hypermobility and particularly EDS, your connective tissue can be a little bit stretchy. And what that means often is that your ligaments don't provide the same end of range support that someone who's not hypermobile has. Now, this can mean you are quite bendy and quite flexible, but the same thing actually applies to the connective tissue that supports your pelvic organs. So it too can be a little bit stretchy if you have hypermobility, and particularly with EDS. The extra stretchiness of this connective tissue in terms of how it supports the pelvic organs can lead to an increased risk of developing prolapse. Now, it is important to point out that women have a risk of a prolapse anyway, just due to our anatomy, and that is irrespective of whether you've had children or not, whether you're hypermobile or not. There are certain instances where your risk of prolapse is higher. In the case of hypermobility or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, where your connective tissue might be affected and might be a little bit stretchy, then that is something that pelvic floor therapists take into account when they're assessing your prolapse risk. So if we look at just your bladder and you imagine it being a big Swiss ball that's hanging from the middle of the room, and you've got 4 ligaments, so 4 connecting straps going to each corner of the room, those ligaments are holding your bladder in place and keeping it from dropping down. Underneath your ball, or your bladder in this case, you would like to imagine a pelvic floor support coming in and underneath. And what that pelvic floor should ideally do is hold the bladder up and provide enough support so the ligaments can be on slack. When the pelvic floor is not as effective for whatever reason, it can drop down, which can mean that there's more strain on the ligaments. So obviously we want to minimize the stress on the connective tissue and the ligaments, and we want to have a nice pelvic floor support underneath so that that tissue is not on strain all the time, because you can strain and tear that tissue, and that can obviously lead to a prolapse and a range of other symptoms. This is particularly relevant when we're looking at cases of hypermobility or EDS, when we're looking at what kind of exercise you would like to participate in. So higher intensity exercises like jumping, running, CrossFit, F45, all of these types of exercise are generally high intensity. They're great types of exercise, but if you have hypermobility or EDS, it's really important that you take into consideration the extra flexibility of your tissue. So if you had hypermobility or EDS and you wanted to participate in a high intensity activity like aerobics or running or whatever it is that you enjoy, then some of the things that we look at are how well do you control your joints, and can we help you learn to better control your joints so that you're not putting your body under excess strain when you participate in these sports that bring joy to your life. Some of the things that women's health therapists look at are whether there's already a prolapse there, what your pelvic floor strength is like, how well you can contract and relax your pelvic floor muscles, in order to try and determine what is the risk of developing a prolapse when you're participating in these exercises. In some cases, a pelvic floor therapist may recommend that you use a pessary in order to continue your high intensity exercise without having a risk of prolapse or any incontinence issues. A pessary is a silicone device, and they come in different shapes and sizes, that is inserted through the vagina, and it provides support for your pelvic organs, and that can help support them and take some of the stress off the pelvic ligaments and the connective tissue that are supporting your pelvic organs, and reduce the risk of damage. In some cases, what actually needs to happen is that your pelvic floor needs some strengthening as well, and you might need some technique adjustments or some postural re-education. Something that we really commonly see in people who have hypermobility or EDS is that they fall forward into a bad position. So their hips move forward over their feet, and they tuck their pelvis underneath a little bit, and they just kind of stand in that position and hang out there with their knees locked and hyperextended. The difficulty of this position is that it makes life really hard for your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor goes from hip to hip, so taking your hips forward over your feet like that does make it harder for your pelvic floor to activate and support your pelvic organs. The other thing that happens when you move into this position is your bladder, which should sit on top of your pubic bone as it fills, actually drops back off your pubic bone, and that makes you more dependent on the connective tissue that supports your pelvic organs to hold them in the right spot and on your pelvic floor. And as I've already said, life's a little bit harder for your pelvic floor already in this position. Unfortunately, the other things that happen in this position is you can see parts of the pelvic floor get a little bit grippy and tight, which means that it's not activating well. You also commonly see the inner thigh muscles, the adductors, get higher tone, so they get grippy as well. This makes it harder for your hips to sit in the right position, and it also makes it really hard for your glutes to turn on. So that takes away some of your support system for your lower back and your pelvis. And it also means that when you're doing squats, you might actually only ever feel it in your thighs and you never feel your glutes burn at all. So if someone came in to see us at Sydney Advanced Physiotherapy and they had hypermobility or EDS, one of the things we would be aiming to do is to teach them how to feel what better joint control feels like and learn how to switch on the right muscles in the right order. EDS also commonly presents with digestive system issues, which can mean IBS, intermittent diarrhea, or chronic constipation, and this also increases the stress and strain on the pelvic floor and the pelvic organs. A good women's health physiotherapist will be able to assess more than just your pelvic floor. They'll also be able to look at the way you move, and in doing this, they'll be able to identify any issues that might be affecting you while you're exercising, and they'll be able to identify risks of you participating in certain types of exercise and hopefully identify ways to overcome those issues. With our women's health physiotherapists at Sydney Advanced Physio, we always make sure that they have an understanding outside the pelvic floor in how the body works so that they can best help you get back to whatever sport it is that you love, and so that they can best understand how the body actually integrates and works as a whole. You can't have something happen to one area without the rest of your body making adjustments to kind of get around that issue, which can be great in the short term, but long term can create some other issues. So it is really important to see women's health therapists that look beyond the pelvic floor and look at your body as a whole and how well it functions as a whole. If you would like to see one of our women's health physiotherapists, you can do so by booking online anytime via our website, sydneyadvancedphysio.com.au. You can also call the clinic on 9416 4410.